Hello, and welcome to this JCT Business Studies screencast. This screencast can be watched by individual teachers or subject departments to help deepen understanding of how to plan for effective teaching and learning in junior cycle business studies. It will be useful to have the business studies specification available during this screencast, which can be found on www.curriculumonline.ie. You can pause the screencast now while you access the specification. In this presentation, we are going to look at how the new specification will shape our approach to planning for teaching, learning and assessment. This screencast outlines an approach to planning with learning outcomes that we hope you find helpful. Planning using learning outcomes is new to many of us, and it is for this reason that we put together this resource. What you will see here was trialled with groups of business studies teachers who provided valuable guidance and feedback, the result of which you are about to see. Before we begin, it is important for us to look at learning outcomes. The learning outcomes are the very foundation of planning. They are what students should know, understand, value, and be able to demonstrate learning in by the end of the 3 years of junior cycle. The learning outcomes in business studies are organised into 3 strands: personal finance, enterprise, and our economy. Our approach to planning involves the development of units of learning. A unit of learning links learning outcomes, which clearly set out what the students should know, understand, and be able to do through their engagement with learning and teaching activities within that unit. By planning in units, we can ensure that students experience all of the learning outcomes through rich learning experiences. By planning for learning and assessment at the outset, we can effectively communicate with students what they are going to learn, why, and how their learning will be assessed. We use the learning outcomes as a bedrock for our planning, and from these we will develop units of learning, linking learning outcomes we feel can be achieved as a combined piece of learning. Planning units of learning will be done within the Business Studies department, where colleagues will decide at the start of the year what learning outcomes will be addressed during that year, and also how the learning outcomes will be linked to form units of learning. Firstly, as a department, we decide on the learning outcomes we would like to address in that particular year, and then look at how we might link these learning outcomes to build units of learning. It is advisable to only link between 1 and 3 learning outcomes at first, and perhaps as we all become more confident, we may see additional links that we would like to make. By linking learning outcomes, we are creating opportunities for a more integrated understanding of a topic, and are showing students how information is not discrete. It is also important to form links across the strands, moving understanding from the personal perspective to the community and business perspective into the national and international perspective. On the JCT website, under the Business Studies Planning tab, you will find a useful linking spreadsheet developed by a group of teachers. This resource shows how the learning outcomes are linked to other learning outcomes, and it will be useful for us initially until we ourselves become more familiar with the learning outcomes. Remember, we are only linking up to 3 learning outcomes at any one time. This resource will give you some guidance as to what other teachers thought linked well together. We must then identify the key learning concepts. This, in practical terms, means the main areas of learning that we need to explore within the unit of learning. The key concepts are grounded in learning outcomes we have chosen as our focus, and they provide a reference point for us in relation to what the students are expected to learn. Having identified the key concepts, it is then important to consider what students could say, make, write, or do to demonstrate their understanding of these key concepts. By planning for assessment from the outset, we are provided with another important reference point: how we will know whether and how well students have learned what was intended. When we are clear from the beginning on what assessment activities we feel will provide us with evidence of the learning achieved, it helps us to focus on the necessary learning and not on the doing throughout the process. Once we have established the key concepts and aligned them with what we want students to be able to demonstrate as a result of their learning, this being our plan for assessment, we can then plan for the learning experiences. These are the methods we feel are the most appropriate and effective to bring about the learning within the unit. Our best hopes for the learning experiences is that they are relevant, engaging, challenging, and motivating. Effective teaching, learning and assessment in junior cycle will mean that students will take more responsibility for their learning. Students will know where they are in their learning and what they need to do to improve. So what can we do to foster this in our classrooms? Much of what we see here are the main principles of formative assessment, but we will also recognise these from our practice as being good teaching principles. Establishing and building on what students already know. From the outset, share with the students the intended learning. Ongoing assessment throughout the unit to check in on the learning. Timely feedback on the learning. And sharing with students what success looks like. We can then gather the resources that we will need for this unit and can add hyperlinks to any online or other digital resources if we wish. We are now going to talk you through the creating of a sample unit of learning. In this example, we have decided that we would like to link the learning outcomes 1.9 and 1.10 together to develop a unit of learning. You might want to now pause the presentation and take a moment to read the learning outcomes to become familiar with them. Another important question to ask is whether or not all aspects of the learning outcomes can be addressed in one unit of learning. Some teachers suggest that yes, we can, and others would say that it may be difficult to adequately address all the learning in one unit. Therefore, it is possible to also highlight particular areas within the outcomes that we wish to address in this one unit of learning. Here we are focusing on ethics, consumer behaviour, and the wider impact of that behaviour. Our next step is to identify the key concepts or key pieces of learning within these learning outcomes. Here we have identified understanding ethics, looking at the wider impact of our own personal consumption, and how globalisation impacts on consumer choice as the main areas of learning. We will start by assessing where our learners are at and move on from there. In this example, we use prompt questioning and start by asking students what their understanding of ethics is. We can then use this information to help us as teachers to gauge where their understanding is at and then progress the learning on from there. In order to assess how the learning is progressing, we've planned the following. Class and group discussion that allows us to listen in to gain an understanding of what has been learned. Using teacher observation, which is a truly valuable form of formative assessment, where we can use verbal or non-verbal cues from students to identify those requiring support or the need for us to adapt our teaching. Towards the end of the learning, we use a walking debate. In this case, the verb debate is an action verb in Learning Outcome 1.9. We felt in this instance that a walking debate could assess the level of understanding achieved throughout the learning, and it would also contribute to developing debating abilities. This could then be extended to include a more formal task, where students could formally present, either orally or in writing, their reasoning and arguments for their particular viewpoint. We have planned to bring about the learning of the key concepts through questioning and class discussion, interaction with videos, ethical case study scenario, using a decision tree methodology, the template for which is available in the Business Studies Resources section online at www.jct.ie, research activities, and a walking debate. We could also include an introductory or theoretical input from the teacher, or engage with other kinds of stimulus material to provoke thought, discussion, and debate. On the JCT website, under the Business Studies Planning tab, you will find 7 samples of units of learning that you can use to guide your own planning. The resource section in the sample units provides some useful links and resources. On the website, you will also find the resource booklet used in the first Business Studies CPD day, and in this you will find a sample Year 1 plan. This presentation is an overview of the planning guidance that was given during the first Junior Cycle Business Studies CPD Day in education centres. The key messages are: the learning outcomes are our bedrock for planning. We use the learning outcomes to shape how we will plan for teaching, learning and assessment across the 3 years. We must plan for our assessment from the outset. Identify how we will do our assessment at the beginning to assess what they already know, during the learning to ensure we are on track, and at the end to see if we have achieved the intended learning. We must decide as a department on the learning outcomes and how we will link these to form units of learning. It is also important to note that planning for teaching, learning and assessment is not meant as a paperwork exercise. It is to support teaching and learning. Thank you for watching this JCT screencast. You can contact the Junior Cycle Business Studies team should you need guidance around any areas mentioned in this screencast, or indeed any other questions you may have. Contact details are available on the JCT website.